Hello, and welcome to the last guided lecture of the year, Unit 12. We call this one Into the 21st Century. It's going to take us up to the present. Away we go. I'm going to try to keep this one short because I have a lot to talk about, but some of it's actually stuff that you lived through. We're going right up to the present day, although not until the very end. We're going to spend most of our time here in the 1990s. So 1992, there's an election. George H.W. Bush is the incumbent. He runs against Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is a interesting candidate, and it's going to be one of the reasons why you see this really funky looking electoral map here for the 1992 election. Bill Clinton is a moderate Democrat. He styles himself as a new Democrat, which he defines as someone who is culturally or socially liberal, but moderate or conservative on fiscal issues. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's one of the reasons why we see this map here. Another reason is because he's from the South. He's from Arkansas, former governor of Arkansas, and so he's able to win some states that are trending towards the Republican ticket throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, and places that are more traditionally conservative. I think Louisiana, Arkansas, his home state, Tennessee, Georgia, also into the Midwest, Iowa, Missouri. These are places that are pretty conservative, but Clinton is able to win some of them because he is a moderate. Clinton is also able to win some of them because he runs on the economy. In 1992, the economy is doing okay, but its growth has slowed since the 1980s. And so George H.W. Bush really is not able to take a great deal of credit for the economy because it's slowing down into 1991 and 1992. The other reason this map looks kind of funky is because of this slice of the pie here that you see that is white. That is an independent candidate, a Texas billionaire by the name of Ross Perot, who also runs, and he gains the largest share of the popular vote by a third-party candidate since, trivia question, give you a moment to think about it, 1912, when good old Teddy Roosevelt ran as a progressive candidate. And so Ross Perot is going to steal a lot of the vote from George H.W. Bush. Perot is running he's running to the right of Bill Clinton. He's running as a more conservative candidate. And Perot's actually a pretty popular candidate, but he's a third-party candidate, and third parties traditionally don't do well in the United States. And so Clinton wins the electoral vote pretty handily, but he wins less than 50% of the popular vote. And so he's going to have to contend with that in his first term. He is a popular-ish president, but he got less than 50% of the vote. And so he is going to focus on the economy. And he is a very lucky president when it comes to the economy, because the economy after he is elected really starts to take off, primarily because of the tech industry in the 1990s. So a lot of this has nothing to do with what Clinton is doing economically, but he is very much going to benefit from it. That moderate thing when it comes to fiscal issues is what is going to make Clinton a little bit different from his Democratic predecessors. If we think about politicians on the Democratic Party like LBJ, certainly FDR, these are people who are raising taxes, who are adding to the debt, and who are increasing the size of the federal government primarily through social welfare programs. Clinton is not going to be that type of a Democrat. He is going to work to lower the debt, to balance the budget. He is going to lower taxes. He is going to roll back federal social safety net spending. So he is a very different type of Democrat compared to what came before him. So he's going to balance the budget in 1996 as an example. He's going to eliminate the deficit, and we're actually going to see a federal surplus by the second half of what will be his 8 years in the presidency. And so that means that the government is actually taking in more money than they're spending. This is something that does not happen historically in modern budgets, really, since like the 1950s. Now, a part of this is some voodoo economics. A part of this is that Clinton is moving some money around. He's kind of taking some money from Social Security. He's putting that towards decreasing the size of the debt. He's putting that towards running federal surpluses. So, like, some of this is short term. The key here for us is the idea that Clinton is going to recognize that something has happened in the 1980s in terms of what Americans want from their president. Americans are very concerned about the debt, about the size of the federal government, about the power of the federal government. And so Clinton is going to fit right into that conservative evolution or revolution, depending on how you want to view it, that Ronald Reagan ushered in the 1980s, or at least that he represented. In some ways, Clinton, a good analogy is Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower is this Republican president in this run of Democratic presidents. You go FDR into Truman, and then you get Eisenhower. And Eisenhower's pretty moderate because he recognizes that he's living through a time when Americans like democratic policies. Clinton is like the flip side of that. You get Reagan, you get H.W. Bush. Clinton recognizes that he has to be more conservative than his Democratic predecessors, because America is living through this conservative time. And so that's the way I would encourage you to look at Bill Clinton. He's a pretty moderate Democrat. In the 1990s, I kind of mentioned this already, but one of the things that categorizes just defines the 1990s is technology. The economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union is changing, and it's changing in large part due to huge technological changes. A part of this has to do with globalization, which is the buzzword of the 1990s. And the internet is what is really going to make a lot of this possible. It's going to shrink the time that the world has to communicate, needs to communicate, and it's going to increase the pace of everything, but it's going to increase the pace of the business world. And you hear this phrase, the flattening of the globe, and the world is flat, is a very famous book by Thomas Friedman about globalization and about what globalization means for everything, for progress, for economics, for the pace of change, and just for how the world runs. The 1990s economically for the United States are a very good time. There's low employment, there's increased standard of living, and so globalization is seen as a net positive. You get to the 2000s, and that some of that's changing a little bit. We're going to talk about that in the next slide, but in the 1990s, the economy is really, really doing well, and Clinton is going to benefit from that. He's reelected in 1996, and he's a two-term president who benefits from this technology boom, this technology revolution. But there is a negative here, and that is that the United States, despite incomes rising throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, is going to continue on this trend of increasing economic inequality, especially when compared with the other Western countries, the other countries that are the best comparisons for the United States in terms of their standard of living and their economies. So what we see is that starting in the 1980s with the Reagan administration, economic inequality begins to rise in the United States, and it continues to rise throughout the Clinton years and into the 2000s and 2010s. So by 2010, the top 1% in the United States holds roughly 40%. The statistic here is 43% of the nation's wealth. And so most Americans throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s are doing better, but the Americans at the top of the economy are doing better than the Americans who are not at the top of the economy. And so we see a wide range of median incomes based on race, gender. This leads to protests throughout the nation due to this economic inequality. And if we look at it today, the United States holds one of the largest income gaps in the world. It depends on which economic indicators you are looking at and how you're defining the top income earners. Is it 1%? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? But the United States has one of the largest income gaps in the world. And this is why I liked this chart, because I think it's useful for us to compare ourselves to the rest of the Western world. And what we see is that from 1980 up through, this is 2017, income inequality in Western Europe has definitely risen. It's gone from 32, 33% to 37% here. But the United States has gone up much more significantly. It's gone up from 34% to over 45%. What does that mean? It's hard to say. Oh, Siri's going to answer it for me. Thank you, Siri. It's hard to say exactly what that means. It certainly means that the United States, its policies are helping to create this situation, government policies. It also just means that the United States economy is doing better for the top earners. That is true as well. So another trend that we should talk about, which is a trend that dates back to the 1960s, but really intensifies post-1980, is immigration. 1965, there's the Immigration Act of 1965 that is passed, and that's the act that abolishes the quota system from the 1920s and creates the modern-day visa system. And what that is going to do is it's going to allow immigration to the United States to increase pretty substantially. And you see that in this poorly colored chart here for our background. I apologize for that. It kind of looks bad. Between 1980 and 2020 years, the number of immigrants who are living in the United States goes from 2.2 million to 9.2 million. That is a substantial increase, over a fourfold increase in the number of immigrants who are living in the United States. Most of these immigrants are coming from South and East Asia, Mexico, and Latin America. And this is due in large part to the immigration reforms brought about by the Immigration Act of 1965. But it doesn't really become a huge talking point until we get to the 1990s, when these numbers are seen by Americans as taking off. In just 10 years, the number of immigrants in the country more than doubles. The Hispanic population by 2000 in the United States is the fastest growing part of the population, not just minority part. It is the fastest growing part of the population. And so there's some really big changes here that are happening. The first push that we see in the 1990s is a push to limit illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is a funny thing to talk about in the United States, because really prior to the 1920s, we didn't have illegal immigration in the same way that we do now. It's not until you get those quota acts in the 1920s that immigration is capped at all by the federal government. And it's at that point that illegal immigration is something that the United States is focused on. But with those quota acts limit immigration to such an extreme amount that there isn't much concern about illegal immigration. The nation is growing at a pretty rapid pace, and illegal immigration is something that is very much in the rearview mirror. Not the rearview mirror. It's just something that is not important to most Americans. But all of a sudden, we get to the 1980s, and with the population of immigrants increasing, illegal immigration is something that is talked about more and more. So the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act is passed in 1996 under the Clinton administration, which is an attempt to limit immigration. And DACA, which maybe you've heard talked about, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, is what creates Dreamers, which are people who are brought here illegally when they are children, but they don't really have a home country to go to. And so DACA is an attempt to fix the illegal immigration system by saying, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make all these people legal. So their status will be changed from illegal to legal. And they have a pathway to citizenship based on them meeting certain criteria, mostly defined by education. But all of this fits into a broader discussion. I mean, I put the border wall up here too, because the border wall fits into this idea that America is facing a crisis in immigration, specifically illegal immigration. We're going to talk more about that when we get to our last slide when we work right up to the present. So immigration throughout this entire time period is something that has been more on the minds of Americans than, I don't know, really since the 1960s, and I would argue since the 1920s. In the 1920s, America puts those quota acts in place, and immigration as a major talking point goes away. It's reformed in the 1960s, but it's not really seen as an urgent issue facing the country until the 1990s again. Perhaps related to immigration as a issue in the United States is the growth of the south and west of the country. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about the rise of the Sun Belt in the 1950s and 1960s post World War II. And that is a trend that has continued. And so by 2000, what we see is that 60% of the population lives in the South or the West, essentially below this line. I do say essentially because it probably should extend up a little bit here into the Pacific Northwest, but not really. I mean, this is San Francisco, like right here. So the majority of the California population is going to be down here anyway. So the Sun Belt is becoming really important culturally and politically. And the Sun Belt is going to drive a lot of the conversations that our country is going to be having over things like immigration. Also the economy as well. I mean, California's economy is like the most important economy in the United States by far. The GDP of California, if California existed as a country, I think California would have like the fifth or sixth highest GDP in the world. So these places, think Texas, think Florida as well, are going to drive a lot of the conversations that we are having as a country. These places also are going to play important roles in Republican majorities. Now, you may look at this and think, well, wait a second, California is Democratic. And that is true. But a lot of California is Republican. California is reliably Democratic, but that's because of its population. Like 60% of it is Democratic. But there's still 40% of a state that has tens of millions of people living in it. There's still probably, I'm guessing at the numbers here, and you can look me up and fact check me. There's probably like 20 to 25 million people who lean Republican in California, to say nothing of the other states here. Texas, huge state with a very large Republican majority. Florida, we call Florida a pink state, although Florida is trending towards red these days. A lot of Republicans there. Still a lot of people in the South as well. Georgia with Atlanta, Louisiana, New Orleans. There are a lot of Republican voters here. Arizona is also a fairly large state. And so this is what's going to help to shape the narrative that the United States is a pretty conservative country. There's also a lot of growing cultural changes that are going to be related to this. And I know you guys feel this, so we don't really need to harp on it all that much. But the United States, since the 1980s, has been living through a lot of cultural fights and has been having a lot of culture wars, cultural battles. And a big part of why is because of the growth of the Sun Belt, which is a pretty conservative area in the country. So moving beyond that a little bit and just taking a look at American society in the 2000s here, America in 2000 is roughly 280 million people. It's far surpassed that now. I think it's somewhere around 340 million people, something like that. But what we've seen is that by the time we get into the 2000s, the population is really growing, is really graying. It's aging. And the United States is continuing this today as the baby boomers are retiring. We also see a growing number of single parent families. This is another trend throughout the 2000s. And another trend, not a trend really, but just an event throughout the 1990s is Y2K. And we always mention it just because it's funny, and I don't know if it's ever showed up on the AP exam, but it wouldn't surprise me too much if it did. There was this huge fear in the late 1990s that when the clock struck midnight on December 31st into January 1st, 1999 into 2000, that all the computers, or a number of the computers, would stop working. When computers were first coded back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, In order to save memory space, some of those computers were coded with the date years as 2 digits instead of 4 digits. So the dates were coded as 66, 67, 68. They were not coded as 1966, 1967, 1968. So the fear was that these computers, when they turned over from 99 to 2000, would think that it was the year 1900 and like they would just stop working. The real fear here was the electrical grid. The real fear was those computers that are running traffic lights, that are running power plants. In reality, the fear was not founded. And when the clock struck midnight, nothing happened. But there were a lot of Americans who convinced themselves that like airplanes were going to be falling out of the skies because all the computers would be like, it's 1900, we do not exist. It's such a strange thing to talk about now. If you were to get in a time machine and go back to December 31st, 1999, you would see all these fears about this stuff, but bunch of nothing. Whole bunch of nothing. So the election of 2000. The election of 2000 is one of the most contentious elections that the United States has had in recent memory. The nation was really split, and this is something that you all have grown up with. Our politics today, at the time of the making of this guided lecture, are very split and very contentious. And in some ways, the election of 2000, I hope, helps you to contextualize the spirit and the feel of the politics in our country today. You hear a lot of people talking about we've never been this split as a country. And that might be true. I don't want to discount that as a possibility. But the thing that we have to remember as students of history is that politics in this country have been split for a couple generations now. The election of 2000 pitted George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush's son, who had been a governor of Texas and was a Republican, against Al Gore, who had been Bill Clinton's vice president for 8 years. Gore receives more popular votes than George W. Bush, but the electoral vote is even closer. And when Americans wake up the day after the election in 2000, they do not know who their president is. And in fact, they do not know who their president is for weeks after the election takes place in November of 2000. And that's because the popular vote in Florida is so close that it triggers an automatic recount, and the race is too close to call for days and weeks. Bush led after the votes are tallied by only 537 votes, and so Democrats ask for a recount, and this is a recount by hand. And the big problem here that is happening in Florida is this really goofy picture that you see on the bottom left of the screen, which is that a number of these ballots that are being recounted have questionable votes. They're being punched out by old machines. And some of these machines are not punching all the way through the ballots, for example. There are indentations that are made rather than clean punch throughs. There's this phrase that becomes known to Americans who are watching in 2000 called hanging chads, right? How do you treat a ballot that has been only partially punched through? Is that a vote or is it not a vote? When you're dealing with millions of votes and the margin is only 537 votes, all of a sudden these questions matter. And so this recount goes on for weeks. And the Bush campaign sues to have the recount stopped. They say, look, at some point you just got to certify these results. You can count these things over and over and over again. And depending on how you look at the ballots, which votes you count, which votes you don't, you're going to come up with different answers. And so the Bush campaign takes it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sides with the Bush campaign and says, yep, the recount has to stop. And so the Supreme Court steps in to stop the recount that is happening in Florida. At that point, Bush was ahead by 537 votes. And so the election is certified for George W. Bush. So it's a really, really contentious election. And so he wins Florida and ultimately wins 271 electoral votes to 266 votes. And so he wins the election. So he comes into office having gained less than 50% of the popular vote and having just won the electoral vote by a razor-thin margin in a campaign that was decided by the Supreme Court. And right off the bat, in his first year in office, George W. Bush is going to have to deal with one of the great tragedies in American history, certainly in the 20th and 21st centuries, since World War II. One thing we haven't talked about yet is that throughout the 1990s, terrorism had been increasingly on the minds of Americans. Throughout the 1990s, there had been a series of terrorist attacks that had been targeting Americans on American soil as well as abroad. In 1993, the World Trade Center was actually attacked. A car bomb underneath one of the World Trade Centers, the parking garage, had gone off. No one was killed in that attack, but it was a concerning attack, obviously, because of what it was and what it meant. In 1998, Al-Qaeda actually attacks two embassies in Africa. U.S. embassies are attacked and people are killed in these attacks. And in 2000, the USS Cole, which is a United States naval warship that is off the coast of Yemen in the Persian Gulf, is attacked by suicide bombers. They drive a small motorboat into the side of the USS Cole, and a number of U.S. sailors are killed in that attack. So terrorism was something that had been on Americans' minds going into 2001, but it was kind of on the back burner. These had all been relatively small incidences, nothing on the scale of September 11th. September 11th, 2001 was the deadliest attack on the continental United States since the War of 1812. And it really shook the nation to its core. When I first started teaching here, the students who I had lived through 9/11. They were 9, 10, 11 years old. They could remember it pretty vividly. Now, at this point, you all don't have memories of this day. And so it's incumbent upon me to talk a little bit about what this day meant for the country. It was a Tuesday, and these attacks happened in the morning of September 11th. You can see with the map on the bottom right, two of these aircraft took off from Boston. One of them took off from Newark, and one of them took off from Washington, D.C. The two aircraft that took off from Boston eventually were the two aircraft that were exploded into the World Trade Center, that flew into the World Trade Centers. The aircraft that took off from Newark was eventually crashed in Western Pennsylvania, and the aircraft that took off from Washington, D.C. was eventually crashed into the side of the Pentagon building. Over 2,500 Americans who were killed in these attacks. Most of them were in the World Trade Center, but there were also Americans who were killed on board the four aircraft. There were Americans who were killed when the Pentagon was attacked as well. It becomes very quickly apparent to America and the world that Al-Qaeda are the perpetrators of these attacks. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization, is a terrorist organization that is a multinational terrorist organization. It is not a country. It is not a state actor. It is a non-state actor made up of individuals who are mostly Islamic. It is a radical Islamic terrorist organization. And at the time of the September 11th attacks, it was headed by a Saudi by the name of Osama bin Laden, which is a name I'm sure most, if not all of you have heard. And Al-Qaeda was bent on destroying the United States, destroying the West, capital W, or at the very least, just bringing terror to the West. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda viewed the West as I don't know how to phrase it. I mean, the great Satan as Osama bin Laden called the West. He viewed the West as having meddled in Islamic affairs, as being something that needed to be destroyed. And so what happens after September 11th is that the United States very quickly moves to attack al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in late September 11th was based primarily in Afghanistan, which was ruled by the Taliban government, which was a government that was a pretty radical government itself and allowed al-Qaeda to exist and operate out of the mountains to the northeast of Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan. And so the United States in October, November, December of 2001 moves to take out the Taliban and to remove them from power, to find Osama bin Laden and to bring him to justice. The war in Afghanistan is a pretty quick war in terms of the effort to remove the Taliban from power and to drive al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. However, it is a very long-lasting war after that in an effort to rebuild Afghanistan and to remove the elements of al-Qaeda from all of the other places that they flee to, because they flee from Afghanistan into Pakistan, into Iran, into Syria, into Yemen, and other places. The other thing that happens after September 11th is the passage of the Patriot Act, and we see the United States moving towards prioritizing security in the wake of September 11th. The Patriot Act empowers the federal government to take all necessary measures or increased measures deemed as necessary in order to protect the United States. The United States is going to ramp up spying on foreign actors as well as U.S. citizens. Creation of the TSA. It's going to change airport visits for every American after September 11th. Increased airport security is a big part of this. There's just so much to talk about with September 11th. It really does change the way that the United States views security and views its role in the world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States turns its attention to globalization, turns its attention to the economy, turns its attention to non-military measures. After September 11th, the United States almost overnight turns its attention to fighting the war on terror. Now, there's sort of a strange footnote here. Maybe footnote is the wrong term, but the United States, as a part of the war on terror, also is going to engage in another war in 2001, which is an invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq is defined by the George W. Bush administration as a part of the war on terror. The George W. Bush administration in 2002 defines these three countries in the world: Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as the axis of evil. George W. Bush makes this speech in 2001 where he defines, 2002, where he defines these three countries as the axis of evil: Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And the Bush administration is going to set its sights on Iraq specifically. Saddam Hussein is the ruler of Iraq. He is a brutal dictator who was the one who invaded Kuwait in 1991, who George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, fought against. And he is murdering his own people. He's murdering the Kurds, who are in the north of the country. He is persecuting other members of the Islamic religion for their beliefs. And so the George W. Bush administration says to the world, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, is attempting to get more weapons of mass destruction, and so we need to invade Iraq. Saddam Hussein is removed from power. The rest of the war does not go well. And we'll leave it at that for today. The domestic policy of the George W. Bush administration is going to be like kind of traditionally conservative. It's going to focus on tax cuts, creates No Child Left Behind, which is an attempt to improve the schooling of the United States. The economy, especially by the second term of the George W. Bush administration, is really going to start to get bad. By 2007 and 2008, the tech bubble is going to burst. Hurricane Katrina happens in 2005, which is a failure of the federal government. And the Great Recession is really going to set in as the housing bubble bursts in 2007. So there's a lot going on here. I mean, there's really a lot that's happening here. How much of this is going to show up in the AP exam? I don't think too much is going to show up on the AP exam. It's a possibility, but we're getting into recent history here, and so I'm kind of just doing this stuff for your edification. I really don't think it's too essential. Okay? Speaking of stuff that I don't think is too essential here, we're getting into the Obama administration. Obama, is elected in 2008. He's pretty much elected because of the economy and because of the situation with the economy. He is a Democrat. He is also relatively moderate compared to the Democrats of the 1970s and 60s all the way back to the 1930s. But he's going to be existing in this conservative framework too. His language is more progressive than Bill Clinton, without a doubt. But what he is able to accomplish is mitigated by the conservative mood of the country. He winds down a series of wars that the United States had been fighting, although he can't really find a good way out of either Iraq or Afghanistan. The Arab Spring takes place in 2010, which is a series of protests in the Middle East. Not a lot comes of that, especially in relation to the United States. Egypt, the government is toppled there, but not too much to note. ISIS is brought to power in 2014. And if you had been taking APUSH in 2014, 15, 16, we would have been talking a lot about ISIS. ISIS has ceased to exist for all intents and purposes, so we don't really need to talk about too much there. And then Russia in 2014 makes this aggressive act. It annexes Crimea. In 2014, we saw a little of this in the video that we watched earlier this week or last week, depending on what class you are in. And that's going to lead into the war between Russia and Ukraine in 2022. But during the during the Obama administration, that's the annexation of Ukraine. Obama also seeks to normalize our relationship with Russia, which had been a pariah state since its revolution in 1959. And it has, the Obama administration increasingly used cyber attacks. Also, we've seen an increasing number of cyber attacks levied against the United States. And this is something that I'm sure is going to continue into the 21st century. Cyber attacks are cheap. Cyber attacks are safe for the countries that are launching them in terms of troops, in terms of cost. They're a lot cheaper. They're also harder to pin on who did it. They're just a little bit safer in that way too. So we've seen an increasing number of those. We also, something that we could have added to the slide, probably should have added, is the increasing use of drones. And this is another thing that as we get into the 21st century, and we talk about warfare, is really changing. The Obama administration is going to spend a whole heck of a lot of money. And the Obama administration is going to do that at first to try to get us out of the recession that Obama inherits. The Obama administration is also going to do that through Obamacare, which is more officially, the official term is the Affordable Care Act, but it's pretty much just called the Obamacare Act, and that you guys know that. It's a half measure. It's not the nationalization of healthcare, but it is moving towards an increased role of the federal government in healthcare. And this is not a policy Obama administration, but what we see as we get into the second term of the Obama years, it's 2012, is the rise of the Tea Party. And the Tea Party is a conservative reaction against the Obama administration and the progressive nature of the Obama administration. And hello, it brings us to Donald Trump. 2016, Donald Trump runs against Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton's wife, and the former Secretary of State, as well as Senator from New York. And y'all know the story here. Clinton wins the popular vote, but Trump wins the electoral vote. What to make of Trump? Well, in the interest of making sure that this PowerPoint is not another 30 minutes long, we're not going to make much of Trump at all, because Trump is probably not going to show up on the AP exam. And there's so much that can be said about Trump. You know, the big thing about Trump, if we're talking about who Trump is as a president, Trump is a very different type of Republican. He does not fit the mold of the Reagan Republican. He is going to pay lip service to the Republican conservative ethos. You know, he's going to say things like, we need tax cuts, we need to shrink the size of the government. But he is also going to say the United States needs to take a smaller role in world affairs. We need to spend less money on our military. We need to get out of NATO. These are not traditional Reagan Republican stances. And so he is a very unique person in the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is still living through what this means. It remains to be seen whether the Republican Party is going to go back to a more Reagan-style approach, or if the Republican Party is going to continue to tack towards this more nationalist, more America first perspective, this perspective that Trump ushered in. Also leaning into the culture wars, a much more racialized view of the world, leaning into issues with immigration, et cetera, et cetera. You guys have all felt that. Do I need to talk about this? No, I do not. Still a fresh wound. So we'll end with this. The 2020 election, again, something that you all lived through and is not necessary to talk about too much, but the election saw Trump against Biden. Biden wins pretty handily, over 300 electoral votes, although popular vote-wise, it was still pretty split, and the country is still pretty split, as you know. And so I was thinking about like how to end this and how to talk about the situation today, and I really struggled with it. And I figured I'd put this up here. This is Gallup polling data. Gallup poll is one of these polling aggregators that just asks these questions of Americans and tries to make sense of the numbers and the data. When you look at the country today, our country is very split, but our country has been split for some time. And that's one of the things I want you to really take away from this presentation, maybe from the second half of this course, is that our country has been split and probably will continue to be split. But these are the things that matter to Americans. The economy and economic problems, a lot of Americans still view that as the central problem that is facing the country today. Inflation, the cost of living, just the economy in general, the debt, income inequality, all those sorts of things. But also immigration, race relations, you know, like Black Lives Matter. These are all things that, again, you feel and you know. So I'm not going to harp on them. But this is the situation that our country finds itself in today. I'm exhausted. I can't imagine how you guys feel. My goodness. Trying to summarize the last 35 years is a real challenge, and I hope that you got something out of it. In class, we're going to take a much broader perspective on these things. We're going to do a number of activities that are painting with broad strokes. And so if you have questions about this lecture, please bring them to class. I hope you learned something.